do you like to do in school? What's your favorite subject? What do you like to do when you're not in school?
I like to read in school, and even out of school I like to read.
Excellent. Excellent. You're a good example for all of our students. And what do you like to do when you're not in school? Besides read?
I like to play, go to ballet, and go to cheerleading, and I like to swim in the summer and do horseback riding.
Wow, you're a very active life. Good for you. Well, thank you very much for coming to start our meeting, and thank you to Mom, and thank you to everybody who came here to support her. We thank you, and we'll send you back home. You can stay if you want, though. Thank you. That's exciting. So next is introduction of guests. I'd like to recognize Commissioner Callahan, who is here, Ruth Ann Callahan, one of our county commissioners, who's at our meeting. Welcome. It's nice to have you back in this auditorium. Anybody else have guests they'd like to introduce? If not, we'll move to the approval of the agenda.
Mr. President, I move to approve the agenda as proposed by the Agenda Planning Committee.
I'll second.
Motion by Mrs. Brightman, second by Mrs. Fisher. Are there any amendments or comments or discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the approval of the agenda? Are there any opposed? The motion passes 7-0, and the student member concurs. Next, we have approval of the minutes.
Mr. President, I'd like to move for the adoption of the minutes from the closed session held on Tuesday, January the 7th, 2014, and also minutes from the business meeting held on the same date.
Motion by Mr. Bailey. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mrs. Brightman. Is there any discussion or comments or amendments to the minutes? Mrs. Harshman?
There's one error on page 28 where it says that the Curriculum and Instruction Committee will meet on January 28th at 11:45. That should read 11:15.
11:15. So there's a motion to amend the minutes to say 11:15. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mrs. Brightman. Any discussion on the amendment or correction? If not, all those in favor of the amendment? 7 in favor, 0 opposed. The student member concurs. Is there any other corrections or comments on the minutes? If not, we return to the motion to approve the minutes. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? Motion passes 7-0, and the student member concurs. Great. Public comment is next. We have one individual who had signed up to speak, but I'm not sure if he is able to make it today. Is there anybody here who would like the opportunity to speak? Okay, we'll move on to new business. The first item is consideration of the consent agenda. Ms. Freeman?
Good evening, Dr. Harding, Dr. Wilcox, and members of the board. Two items for your consideration this evening. The first is a purchase order for some plumbing work that we need in the office of the Administrative Center. WCPS contacted about 6 companies beginning in early December to attempt to obtain price quotes for some plumbing work that we needed down in that kitchen area at the Administration Center. We were only successful at getting quotes from 2 companies, Musser Mechanical and Beaver Mechanical Contractors. To ensure ongoing progress of work at the building, Dr. Wilcox authorized the award of this work to Beaver Mechanical Contractors on January 16th. It allowed Beaver Mechanical Contractors to get to work right away working in that area. This procurement was not advertised for competitive formal bids. It was treated as an exception to the bidding rule as an emergency repair. Staff is here this evening to answer any questions that you may have regarding that procurement and is requesting approval of the bid waiver and purchase order KK 7352 to Beaver Mechanical of Hagerstown, Maryland in the total amount of $83,220. That's for the base bid and alternate 1, and that is the lowest of the 2 responsive quotes that we received. The second item on the agenda this evening is a solicitation for proposals for auditing services. Auditing services are needed to obtain an express opinion on the board's fair presentation of the board's FY14 financial statements. This solicitation was advertised in mid-October, and we did receive proposals back on, see if it's in the report here. The proposals came back to us sometime just before the proposal mailed. I don't have that date in the report. I apologize.
I
It's
think
missing.
December 13th.
Is it December 13th?
Bid opening December 12th,
That was when we mailed the
2013.
proposals. Excuse me?
It says bid
On
opening was
December
conducted
12th.
on December 12th.
I apologize. Yeah, we did receive those proposals on the 12th. I remember very clearly, I was there. But 3 companies submitted those proposals, and they were distributed to members of the Audit Committee. The members of the Audit Committee met on January 13th. Their names are Mr. Jeff Yingling, Mr. Al Martin, Ray Gray, and Ron Shipler. And they were instrumental in helping to formulate the recommendation that's being presented here this evening for your consideration. The proposals were ranked individually in accordance with the point system, but at the end of the day, the team felt that the differences technically were so minor that they recommended to move forward and base the award recommendation on price alone. And that's the report that you have in front of you today. The lowest bidder, Smith Elliott, at $286,316 for a total, for a 5-year commitment, is being recommended for a 1-year contract with options for extension for those additional years. So that 5-year total is $286,316, nearly 5.5% lower than the next bidder. The Audit Committee is respectfully recommending that the Hagerstown firm Smith Elliott Kearns and Company be employed as the Board of Education's independent auditor to perform the FY 2014 audit with options for renewal of the contract for years 2 through 5.
Thank you, Ms. Freeman. Is there a motion regarding the consent agenda?
Mr. President, I move to approve purchase order KK 7352 to Beaver Mechanical, Inc. for a plumbing project at the Administration Building at $83,220, and RFP 2014-33 to Smith Elliott Kearns and Company to perform the fiscal year 2014 audit at a cost of $54,970. And that's broken down in the audit as $46,980 plus agreed to procedures of $7,990 and hourly rates for supplemental services if needed.
Motion by Mrs. Brightman. Is there a second?
Second, Mr. President.
Second by Mr. Ridenhour. Is there any discussion? Mrs. Brightman?
Question on the point system for the audit selection. Under Smith Elliott, it mentions 72 points. The committee made a 3-point reduction because while the total commitment of staff time was reasonable, the bidder did not differentiate between staff time that would be committed by level. And I think I'm understanding that as expertise. So I guess my question, would we anticipate additional cost or change orders if a higher level of expertise is required?
Not under the contract, the way it's bid.
That's okay.
It's a lump sum contract.
So it's up to them to provide the correct expertise at this point. That wouldn't come through to us as a change order.
No.
Okay. Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments? I'll just ask one quickly. Smith Elliott Kearns is the incumbent firm that's been doing our audits for 5 years, and I know there's value in having different firms conduct audits over a period of time because they tend to look at different things. Their approach might be a little different. Are we comfortable, and maybe this is a question for Chris or for Mr. South that I probably know the answer to, but are we comfortable that another, at least one, if not probably realistically 5 more years with the same firm makes sense?
We are comfortable. They intend to rotate some of their staff, so we'll be seeing some different faces as we move into the second contract. So while the partner in charge will be the same person, we'll be seeing some different faces as they rotate into the second contract. So we're comfortable that we will get the level of objectivity that the board is seeking.
That's great. Thank you. That's what I hope the answer would be. Are there any other questions or comments? If not, the question is on the motion to approve the consent agenda. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? The motion passes 7-0, and the student member concurs.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is personnel action.
Dr. Hardings, Dr. Wilcox, members of the board, as discussed in closed session, there are several personnel actions for your consideration this evening.
Thank you. Is there a motion to approve the personnel actions recommended by staff?
Mr. President, I move for the approval of staff recommendations for personnel.
I'll second.
Motion by Mr. Bailey, second by Mrs. Fisher. Is there any discussion on the recommended staff changes? If not, all those in favor? Are there any opposed? The motion passes 7-0, and the student member abstains. I forgot to call for abstentions.
You don't call for abstentions according to Robert's rules.
There we go. I just got burned. That's what my kids would say.
Thank you.
All right. Next is board member committee reports. Mrs. Harshman, curriculum.
Yes, curriculum will meet January the 28th at 11:15 in the board conference room. The agenda will be posted.
Thank you, Mrs. Harshman. Mrs. Williams, finance.
Yes, the Finance Committee will meet on February 11th at 3:30 in the board conference room.
Okay. Thank you. Mrs. Fisher, policy review and development.
Policy Committee will be having its first meeting of the year, January 28th at 1:15, also in the boardroom.
All right, Mr. Bailey, facilities.
Facilities will meet January the 28th. We will be meeting at the new Downsville office building, and part of the agenda will be a tour of the building.
Great, thank you. Mr. Ridenauer.
HR will meet, I believe it is January 31st at 12:30 in the HR conference room.
Could I add something about policy?
You sure can. I'm sorry if I got ahead
Next
of you.
month, we're planning on starting to have double meetings per month. We'll be meeting twice a month to
Okay.
try and get caught up.
Well, the more work we do, it seems the more gets thrown
The
at us.
state
so.
keeps throwing them at us.
Great. Any other reports? I know there was a MABE conference planning committee meeting. Is there any report out from that? Mrs. Williams, Mrs. Harshman?
Just, we started working on the different activities that will take place there, and I think it's going to be a very exciting conference. I hope everybody will try to attend and keep that date open in October for it in Ocean City. It is going to be well worth your while. We're working on keynote speakers, and of course the superintendent, the state superintendent, will be there.
Great. Mrs. Brightman, anything from MABE's Board of Directors, MABE Legislative?
Board of Directors met last week. Just a brief report. Jack Smith, the Deputy State Superintendent, spoke with us. He was there for probably about a half an hour. And again, as a board member, you hear bits and pieces of Race to the Top and Common Core and ESEA, and then all of a sudden the light bulb goes off and you sort of make some connection. that you had made before, and he was able to do that, at least for me. He was talking about the ESEA flexibility waiver, and of course it was for a 2-year period, and they wanted another 2 years, but instead asked for a 1-year extension, and they're not sure if they can get any further extensions. And if ESEA, which is federal legislation, is not reauthorized, and we don't get another waiver or an extension, our whole accountability system, reverts to the original No Child Left Behind in the annual yearly progress, the AYP. So that was one of those things that I hadn't really thought about, and that's, I think, further cause for us to try to get Congress to do something. The No Child Left Behind has been waiting 6 years to be reauthorized, and I would imagine it won't happen this year, but we can only hope. So that could sort of mess up everything. He also discussed MSA waiver testing, which we're going to talk about later in the agenda, and his comment was that it could be used for internal evaluation by school to see how it might inform the student learning objectives. And of course, Superintendent Lowry and Governor O'Malley are still very supportive of keeping the MSA testing. And again, we'll discuss that later. He also mentioned, which I thought was maybe a little light or sunshine, that the concern that there will be no year-over-year data once we switch from MSA to the PARCC testing, and it's going to take some time to get numbers to compare with, and the 20% of the evaluation that is connected to those tests might be delayed. So that may be a little piece of good news for some of us who are concerned about that. The budget was passed, the 2015 budget, with a 5% increase in member fees. And I would ask my colleagues to hold 2 dates. May 29th is the LSA meeting at the Anne Arundel School Board. They'll be discussing the ramifications of student discipline regs. And they always do the yearly special ed update, and that's June 9th. And of course, that is open to staff, administrators, and elected board members. So that's my report.
Mr. Grunendijk, anything from student government?
Nothing to report right now.
All right. Anybody else have anything to report from committees on which they serve, here or MABE or otherwise? All right, then we move on to miscellaneous business. First item under miscellaneous business is consideration of the proposed state student discipline regulations. Mr. Trotta?
Good evening.
Good evening.
I'd like to provide some background information regarding the State Board of Education's proposed changes to the current student disciplinary regulations. The State Board issued a notice inviting members of the public to provide comments on the new proposed changes. And on November 1st of 2013, the Washington County Board of Education provided a comprehensive response to the State Board, outlining its concerns about what was being proposed. On December 18th, 2013, there was an important development. The president of the State Board of Education, Dr. Dukes, issued a letter of clarification, making it clear that school systems and school boards should not interpret the new proposed regulations as prohibiting a superintendent or a school system from assigning a student who had been disciplined to a particular classroom or school. There was a concern that the regulations would require that a superintendent return a student to a particular school, even if the superintendent had concerns about the safety of the student, other students, or staff members. So the State Board made it clear that that was not their intention when they issued the proposed regulations. At some point in January of 2014, the Maryland Association of Boards of Education submitted its comments regarding the proposed regulations. Then on January 8th of 2014, the Attorney General, Eric Holder, and the U.S. Department of Education Secretary, Mr. Duncan, were in Baltimore to announce a series of federal recommendations regarding student discipline. They particularly expressed a concern that there was a disproportionate suspension of African Americans and students with special needs when it came to student suspensions. The board, I believe at its last board meeting, had discussed providing some supplemental comments to the state board regarding the regulations. And I believe we're at that point in the discussion about whether additional comments should be submitted. And I'm glad to respond to any questions.
Okay. Is there any discussion?
I
Mrs.
can
Brighton?
sort of open it up if that helps. There's sort of two issues here. Is at our previous meeting, we did discuss writing a letter and submitting, not a letter, but comments, follow-up. At that time, Mr. Trotta, and help me remember what we had talked about. Were there any significant differences in our second suggested comments from the first letter that we sent?
The draft indicated that we still continue to have concerns.
Mm-hmm.
It also provided that the comments that were provided by the state president, Dr. Dukes, that those comments should be incorporated into the regulations. And those were the two main points of that second submission. I understand that Anne Arundel County submitted a response to the state board where they actually were thinking along the same lines that we were, in that they once again, they were concerned about where a student would be returned, which school they will be returned to upon completing their disciplinary action. And they were very pleased that Dr. Dukes had clarified that particular point. And they too felt that there should be something addressed in the regulation that incorporated Dr. Dukes' comments. So I would say that that's the key point in that second letter. But the Anne Arundel County Board of Education has picked up on that particular point and made that particular point to the state board.
And I think Mabe's comments also noted Dr. Duke's letter as well.
It did as well. I mean, I believe her letter is a very significant development in the process, and I would recommend to the superintendent and to the board, as they go forward in updating the student disciplinary regs that we have here in Washington County, that we also want to incorporate Dr. Duke's comments into any board policy and or administrative regulation, because it is one of the critical points as far as providing latitude to local boards of education to make the appropriate placement of a student upon their return to the school system after they've completed their disciplinary action.
And just to follow up, I guess where I'm trying to go is, to me, when the federal government, when the Justice Department and DOE came together to Baltimore City right in the same time that we were discussing this as a board, to me that's a huge game changer. And it's a big deal. It brings in a whole different team. From what I understand, and I just went through some of the federal regs, or they're calling them guidelines, but I think we all know that that means mandates. But just to give an example of why I think they're coming into this changed the whole situation, and I think influenced our decision to not send a letter in response in the timeline that we had talked about. One is that superintendents, principals, and teachers are all going to be held liable In other words, a teacher, if they refer a student, they're considered to be the decision point as to whether that student should be referred for some consequences or an infraction. And so we're talking about, before it was more of a principal decision or an AP and the superintendent, and now the teachers will be held liable. Massive professional development of mental health, data collection, reporting. What I understand is even volunteers in our schools will need to be trained in these guidelines. There seems to be a hostile attitude in the federal regs toward the role of our school resource officers. They're going to define what the role of the SRO is, and we're not going to be able to deviate from that. And what I also understand is that the federal government is thinking or moving toward investigating very proactively, not waiting for complaints. So my personal concern, as I spoke with members of our quick response team, is that we really needed to stop and reassess where we were moving in this, and did we really want, since I think Maryland is going to be considered the poster child for this whole federal student discipline issue. I know that George Soros from the Open Society is going to be moving in a PR countrywide, and they're going to be pointing to Baltimore City and Maryland as the state that's getting it right. So there's going to be, my concern was that if we weren't careful, we might flag ourselves and get undue attention. And I'm just curious how you've read the federal guidelines. I know there's, over 150 pages. So I've just started going through them. But again, this comes back to how we view a quick response team and whether this board is willing to give the latitude necessary, which we discussed in a work session, to be able to react to changing events. And again, I think this federal, I won't call it intrusion, but the addition of this federal action, I think, changes everything. So I just put that out to my colleagues.
Are there other comments? Mrs. Wayne?
Going back to the quick response team, we did discuss quick response team in a work session that was on November 5th. And my understanding at that time was that the quick response team would react to pending legislation and would make the board aware of what was happening. My concern in this instance is that, as I reviewed the minutes from that meeting, that there was no real action taken. There was no vote as to the creation of a quick response team. And I don't know that the quick response team, as we discussed it, would have the authority to overturn an action decided by 7 members of the board. I think the decision was made by consensus to send a letter, and I think the understanding was that the letter would contain our continued concerns, our support for local governance, and the examples of success that we had had here in Washington County. When I reviewed the letter that had been prepared, I saw nothing inflammatory or wrong about the letter. So on the merits of the letter, while I respect Mrs. Brightman's opinion that her concern is that we're in some way going to flag ourselves and draw undue attention to ourselves, I think if local governance is a matter of importance to this board, and it's a legislative priority, that we take every opportunity to stand in support of that and not back away from it. going back to the quick response team, I don't know, perhaps we need a policy. If we're going to have such a thing, we need to have a policy that spells out how this quick response team would act. And again, I don't know that we even formally had a vote to say that we would have such a thing, but I'm concerned the process, the way that this played out. I think that the decision was made to not carry through with the decision of the board. And that's a concern to me. I think that there are 7 members of the board that have been elected to make decisions, and I don't know that legally I can give up that responsibility and say no 2 or 3 members of a quick response team can reverse the decision made by the board. So those are my concerns with regard to how this was handled.
May I more
Mr.
than
Ridenhour?
let you respond? I disagree in some respects, Mrs. Williams, with your statement. The consensus that we reached, and if I remember correctly, I think I said to you, Don, I had some concerns, but felt since the majority felt a letter should go out that was okay. From my perspective, it was okay. There was nothing in the consensus that set a date. From the time that we made that consensus until today, a little over 2-week period of time, as Mrs. Brightman has said, circumstances changed. If we were not, the letter we were writing did not have, or we were unaware of at that time, how this was playing out. You know, one of the things that I've learned and have learned for a long period of time, particularly when I was a teacher, you fight the battles you have a chance to win, and you choose your battles carefully. I believe what Mrs. Brightman and the quick response team, Dr. Hardings, did and tried to convey to us was that the situation has changed, the circumstances have changed. They wanted more direction from the board because of those set of circumstances, as there was no date established to send the letter out. You know, well, no, there wasn't in the consensus agreement. There may have been discussion, but there was nothing that stated in the consensus that it would be sent by a specific date. Well, I disagree. So I will leave that. My perspective is that when a set of circumstances changes and it could impact our position in future events, then I think as a board we need to sit down and talk about it. That's why I thought the leadership decided to bring it back today so that it could go through and talk about it and make a determination. Is this still the course of action we wish to take? If it is, then we're going to send it. We can put a date on it and say send it tomorrow. If it's not, then we haven't put ourselves in a compromised position. I have no desire to get in a spinning contest with the Attorney General of the United States nor the Secretary of Education. It's that simple. I don't see anything that we gain from that. So,
I'll chime in here because I'm the one who has to actually sign the letter, put the stamp on it. And from my perspective, the decision not to do those two things didn't have anything really to do with a quick response team. What it had something to do with is that as we were in the process of drafting the letter, and I heard from at least 3 of my colleagues, Mr. President, I think we need to put the brakes on this. I did not want to send a letter that I didn't think at the time held the majority support of the board. If the board reaches consensus to take some act, and circumstances may change, and members contact me and say we shouldn't do this, if we have a chance to come back together again and discuss it before a deadline, that's the decision I'm going to make. Now, people can criticize me for that, but that's the decision I made and why I made it. So the question I think today is, the letter's prepared, everybody's seen it. Do we want to send it, or do we prefer to get to work on the discipline regulations and move forward? And if the majority of this board says we got to send a letter, then I will put my signature and a stamp on it tonight. Mrs. Harshman?
I just have a question. I remember at the top of the email, I believe, from Mr. Trotta, it said that comments must be received by January 13th. So is there any purpose in sending a letter now that is well past the deadline for the comments to be sent in?
The State Board isn't taking action till the 28th. so
Well,
we can
I'm just going by what was on the email. It said comments must be in by January 13th. So I don't know if that means after that they're not going to bother to read them, they'll go in the circular file, or whether it makes absolutely no difference that they sent out, the deadline was January 13th. I mean, I don't know, I'm asking.
But the deadline is established by the State Board, and it was the 13th.
Okay.
If we send a response now, it would be speculative as to what would occur with that response. We certainly would send it to all the individuals that we noted in the letter. There's a number of public officials that are copied on the letter.
But it would not get the formal attention that it would have had it been received by the deadline. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure what attention that they would give to it. They have an official file. They probably have closed that on the 13th. But once again, if there are communications afterwards, it would go to them and they would decide whether it would be considered or not.
Well,
I don't, there's nothing, I mean, I'm not aware of anything that they
Right.
would not accept it. I think that they would accept the communication.
Then that's my pause for concern there, that the letter was approved by the board and it was not carried through.
Well, yeah, I would just share with you, I think that the proper process was followed. There's no violation of any laws or regulations. I think that the decision was a sound one. There was a concern that after the board had its discussion at the last business meeting, that circumstances had changed considerably. And I think I've shared with the members of the board and key staff the communication from the Department of Justice and the Department of Education. And I have here some of the publications that they have issued. So it's very clear that they've sent a message across the country that going forward they're going to be very aggressive in addressing any concerns that may be brought to their attention, or any concerns that they may identify if they believe that certain districts, and I think in the literature they've identified a few districts that they have concerns about. So I think that there was a very cautious decision to have some further discussion and direction from the board before the letter was sent. And I believe that it was a sound decision, given the change in circumstances.
I have just a brief question for Mr. Trotta. You said that Anne Arundel County made comments about the...
Yes.
About this. When did they send those in? Were those in the... before the deadline or after the deadline?
It was transmitted by email, which is permissible.
Mm-hmm.
The copy that I have indicates that they submitted it on January 13th, 2014.
Okay, so those were on the deadline.
Yes.
Well, we're now in a position of determining whether we're going to send this letter or whether we're not going to send it.
Mr. President, if discussion is closed, I would move to not send the letter at this time.
That's a motion by Mrs. Brightman. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Ridenhour. Is there any discussion on the motion? Mrs. Harshman?
Would the contents of the letter have to be changed in order to address the information that we were given after that? I mean, would we send this letter that we didn't send because of changes? And would we send it unchanged?
I think the motion is to not send the letter.
The existing letter.
If there's something, a discussion following that on another letter that might be sent, that discussion could be had, I suppose. But the motion on the floor right now is to not send the letter.
As is with the additional information not included. Is that what?
That's correct. I believe the motion is to not send the letter or a letter.
Decided not to send the letter. Wasn't the decision already made not to send the letter when the letter wasn't sent?
We have another opportunity to send the letter, and my motion is simply advising or is asking my colleagues to agree not to send a letter at this point in time.
A letter or
A
the
letter, excuse me, a letter.
Any letter.
Mrs. Williams?
I would just like to say that my reason for voting not to send the letter at this time is that we would be sending it past the established deadline. I think that would reflect poorly on this board. And it would not be part of public comment if there was an established deadline. So there's no purpose that I see sending the letter. So I'll be voting not to send the letter.
Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, the question is on Mrs. Brightman's motion. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? The motion passes 7-0. The student member concurs. Next on the agenda is a discussion of the future of MSA and HSA testing. As many people may be aware from reports in the paper, both locally and at the state level, there is a lot of discussion about having the state superintendent request a waiver from the U.S. Department of Education for the testing requirement under the No Child Left Behind law. The question is, do we want to take a position on this, either in favor, opposed, or take no position at all? All members have been provided with a copy of the bill that's under consideration in both the House and the Senate. Members have also been provided information from Mrs. Brightman, and thank you for keeping us all in the loop on this, of actions that some other boards have taken, and I'll open it up for discussion. Mrs. Fisher, I'm sorry.
How long does it take to give the test?
It's 3 days a week for 2 weeks, if I recall correctly.
Dr. Marco, do you know how many hours the MSA exams as they're currently configured take? I know they're given over a 2-week window.
There are 4 testing sessions from, I believe, 2 hours to as much as 4 hours per day. Where you would have typically your reading would be Monday, Tuesday, it would be 2 hours one day, 3 hours the next day. And in the following week, you would have your math, which is similar configuration.
So 10 to 12 hours of actual in-class assessment. Mrs. Fry, does that ring about right with you? Thank you.
Do any of the curriculum staff members know if we would actually be using the results of the MSA here ourselves to benefit our students or our curriculum in any way once we get the results?
I think there are a couple of places where we would use the results. We would certainly use the results in some of our teacher evaluation processes. As you know, the TIF grant requires that we have some assessments. Right now, written into the TIF grants is the use of the MSA results. We certainly could look at amending our TIF application, but it would be, I think, a difficult lift at this late stage. We do know that there is a significant amount of the curriculum that is the same, and we certainly could look at that data and be able to help some of our young people. But I think generally we would choose to look at it in a more cursory level and then move about the business of preparing for delivering the Common Core curriculum and moving towards the PARCC assessments. In this district, we really focus almost all our time and energy right now on great classroom instruction, and we try to measure that using the MAP assessments. For those people who are listening into this conversation, the MAP assessments are a set of assessments that we think will look and feel much like the Park assessments. They are the measures of academic progress, is that correct? And we give those assessments 3 times a year.
Are there other comments or thoughts? Mrs. Brighton?
Go ahead.
I was just going to sort of put some things out there to be provocative, to get the discussion rolling. It appears pretty clear from everything I've read in various newspapers, what I'm hearing through MABE, what I'm hearing from other colleagues throughout the state, that Governor O'Malley and State Superintendent Lowry are on the same page as far as the MSA testing. And my understanding, and I've seen it in print once in the Baltimore Sun, that the governor has said he would veto any legislation that came through waiving the MSA. That said, if any board would decide to support the emergency legislation being put in on both sides to waive the MSA, it would, I think, be a symbolic message. That said, sometimes symbols can be strong things. If you read the MSCA paper, Tsunami of Ed Reform, if you look at how many of us talked for years about this misalignment and the, building the plane in the air and all the different ways we just knew that this problem was going to come, and now it's here. And I know there's a concern about getting the legislature involved in operational matters, but I would say the governor and past state superintendent Nancy Krasnick already invited the legislature to the table when they asked them to do the Education Reform Act of 2010. They brought them right in and said, be part of our work and be part of our business. So I think they're already there. I don't think we would be inviting them or setting a precedent that isn't already there. And I know that there are some morale issues with our teachers, our frontline employees. And every so often, it's a good thing. We may not be able to give on every issue on all these mandates, but this is one of those that we might be able to say it doesn't make good common sense. It's a diversion from the Common Core standards, what we're trying to do, and maybe we could send a message. So I just throw out some of those thoughts.
Mr. Ridenhour?
Well, a couple of things, and I agree with Donna in some respects that symbolic gestures sometimes can have an impact, but they can also be expensive sometimes too. I'm just wondering, how much do we have invested to test this year? What are we dumping down the tubes, and how much more will it cost us? I mean, I think there's how much money do we have in it? How much will we save if we don't do it? Got to look at it from an economic point of view too. And I don't know if you can even answer that at this point in time. But I know that we have spent money preparing to administer these tests. Personally, I hate tests. Dr. Wilcox knows how much I hate tests. System-wide testing, I can't stand it. I can't stand them coming from the state. That being said, I also understand politics fairly well. And the big boys are now going to duke this out, with Montgomery County involved. I'm more inclined to let them fight it out than putting ourselves in the middle of it. I just think it could get very costly. I think it could be, I'm not certain that this is the time. Again, is this one we're going to win? Do we have any chance of winning? I would say that the odds are 20-80 against. I think there might be an outside chance, but I'm not sure. And how much do we benefit from that if it happens? And I agree with you. The legislature may have put themselves in the middle of it, but I don't want them putting themselves in the middle of a lot of things. And I'm still, I'll be very truthful with you. Up until the time we raise our hands, I'm gonna be pushing this thing through my brain from two different ways. So it was just, I think the point I'm trying to make is, what are we going to benefit from it? If somebody would tell me, well, it probably is $200,000 less if we don't have to administer it than it would be if we do. But I'm not sure anybody can tell me that right now. I don't know what we're going to cost and what we're going to get. Go ahead. I'd love to hear an answer.
Should I respond? The legislation is written so that if the waiving of MSA is, let me get this right, more expensive than the penalty that the federal government would place upon us. Am I getting that right?
Here, can I read the?
Yes, thank you.
Please.
All right.
There's the bailout section.
If the State Department of Education has not received a waiver or a response from the U.S. Department of Education 2 weeks before the Maryland school assessment is scheduled to be administered, the department may not administer the MSA unless the department determines that the penalty the department would receive from USDA for not administering the MSA is more than savings or benefits the department would receive from not administering.
So basically, if they determine that it's more costly than
The penalty versus the savings. So that sort of addresses your concern about the money.
Mrs. Williams?
Mrs. Fisher asked a question about the amount of time that it takes for students to take the test. There's also time involved in preparing the students to take the test. There's time that administrators and other school staff spend coordinating, collecting, all of that. And that is all time that the focus is taken off of the curriculum that we are supposed to be teaching now. Yes, it's true that MSA does not align, and as an educator, I know that it's important to have an alignment of curriculum, instruction, and assessment. So yes, there is a misalignment, but I think students would be missing out on instructional time if we go through with this MSA and not ask for the waiver. There's no guarantee that even asking for the waiver that we would be granted the waiver. But I think that sometimes we need to ask ourselves what's best for students. And I don't know that having students sit for this test is best for them instructionally or in terms of those students that don't do well. It's just another message that is sent to them that, here's a test that's even more difficult for you because this isn't what we've been teaching you. So those are my concerns.
Are there other comments?
Do we know,
Mr.
like,
Greenberg?
when this bill would be enacted? If it did go through, like, how soon would this be enacted then?
It's an emergency bill, so it's enacted as soon as it's passed and then the governor signs it.
And
If the governor signs it.
but when would this happen then?
I think the hearing on the first bill, I think the
Well,
hearing in the
February
Senate is
5th is the
5th.
hearing.
Okay.
Testing's March, correct?
Testing is March.
Testing's
So it would all
March.
have to be settled before.
I'll chime in. I am very, very hesitant to support something that tells the state superintendent what she ought to do. Just the language in the bill gives me great pause. It says, directing the state superintendent. Now, the state superintendent is the chief academic officer in the state, hired by the state board, which is independent of the legislature, to use her best professional judgment to make decisions about education in the state of Maryland. She certainly knows that waivers can be obtained from federal government requirements. And the reason we know she knows that is because she's asked for them in the past. She has decided that it is not in the best interest, in her judgment, in the state of Maryland to ask for a waiver from this requirement. If we as local school systems, and I think the legislature, are going to try to do an end run around her judgment about what is an operational matter, we don't tell the superintendent here what assessments to give. We didn't tell him to give the MAP test. We don't tell him not to give the MAP test, because that's an operational matter that he decides in consultation with his staff based on what he thinks is in the best interest of students. And I worry about us asking the state legislature over the state superintendent's head and over her best judgment to force her to do this if she doesn't believe it's in the best interest of our students. And I was thinking about a good analogy, and actually you don't have to go very far. We sort of have one here. It was about a year ago at this meeting that this board made a difficult decision, and that was to sign the contract for the Allegheny Energy Building. That was based on the superintendent's recommendation after a charge that we gave him. He brought that recommendation back, and he asked us to support his recommendation. Ultimately, we did, but there were some members of the community who didn't want us to make that choice. They wanted us to go someplace else. Those members of the community, some of them, not all of them, but some of them, went to the county commissioners and said, you control the Board of Education's money. You tell them you're not going to give them money unless they make the decision that we want. And I think we were rightfully upset by that, because our decision about where we're going to put our building with money that's in our fund balance was our decision to make. I think the decision about whether to request a waiver from this particular requirement is the state superintendent's decision to make. And I am very, very hesitant to set the precedent, as you say, of local school systems and the legislature getting involved in a decision that is operational. The state superintendent thinks there's value in giving the assessment. And I think those are the judgments that we as a state pay her to make. So I won't support I won't support trying to get the legislature to pass an MSA waiver.
I think an important capstone to your comment, Dr. Hardings, is that those members in the community went to the county commissioners, found a county commission that would not step into that fray.
Absolutely. And we're grateful for that. So I oppose just on good governance grounds. And not to put too fine a point on it, but I think this is the problem we run into when the federal government gets too involved in our local decisions. We run into these conflicts, and I don't think we help that dynamic when we try to do an end-to-run around what I think is a good structure that has served the people of Maryland well with the state superintendent.
Dr. Hardings, if I may, I want to say that all of you brought up some very, very good points. I'm particularly moved by the comments that Mrs. Williams made, because there is absolutely an opportunity cost to this if our teachers feel compelled to drop everything and change what they're doing as they move towards teaching to a new set of curriculum standards in order to have a short-term bump on the MSAs. I would assure this board that we have said repeatedly over 2 years, do not do that. We understand that there is a misalignment. We understand that there is a test that must be taken. It is, in fact, the law. It is also predicated a piece that many agreements between the state of Maryland and the federal government have made. We are likely going to have to give it. But we've said to our teachers over and over and over again, and we've said to our administrators, if we're doing the right thing by our kids with this Common Core curriculum, this test will take care of itself. We do not need to stop and shift and change gears. We are going to move through this and into that next iteration of accountability without giving it a whole lot of thought. And I think this board has consistently supported me in that conversation, that they know that this is a difficult year. I think this board has supported our teachers in that. We have tried to design systems, even the accountability system, which uses MSA data in a way that is forgiving as we've moved towards SLOs, specific learning outcomes. So, again, I'm not sure at this point in time that there's a great deal of utility in being the poster child for not giving it. I think there's some other districts that are happy to take that role. I simply would say to you, irregardless of the position, it is not going to change our focus on great instruction for kids every day. It is not going to change our focus on implementing and delivering the Common Core with great fidelity. I will say again publicly, we do not expect or want our teachers to change their practice. We want them to stay the course. And if the MSAs are given in the next couple of days, that's great. It's just a simple distraction. It is a bump in the road for us.
Are there any other comments? Mr. Bailey?
I've been torn, like Mr. Ridenour. One moment on one side, next moment I'm on another side with this. But I've tried to think through this and remember how I voted when we decided to go with the race to the top as a board. We decided to do that when our neighbors were rejecting it. So I think that's what's going to be my guidance in the vote that I make is we committed to it at that time, and this is a part of that commitment. And I feel that we need to follow through with what is contained in that commitment.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Is there any other discussion? Well, we can take no position, we can take a position in favor, or we can take a position opposed. Those are sort of the options we have. If someone wants to make a motion, we can do that. If there's no motion, then we can.
Mr. President, I move to support Senate Bill 165 and cross over House Bill 117.
Motion by Mrs. Brightman to support the Senate bill and the House bill. Is there a second?
Second.
Second from Mrs. Hirschman. Is there any discussion, any further discussion?
When you say support, does that mean that we just send a letter that says that we support this? Is that it, or is there?
No, basically, we would go on record as supporting the legislation as written.
Any other comments? If not, the questions on Mrs. Brightman's motion to support the Senate bill. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion fails, 3 in favor and 4 opposed, and the student member agrees with the prevailing side. Correct? Are there any other motions or action we want to take on that? Do we want to take no action or oppose?
Mr. President, I move that the board take no action on Senate Bill.
It's 165 and cross over House Bill 117.
Take no position.
No position.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Ms. Fisher. Is there any further discussion? If not, the questions on Mr. Ridenour's motion to, as a board, officially take no position. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion passes 5-2, and the student member concurs with the majority. Next on the agenda is future agenda items. The Agenda Planning Committee did meet today. We are going to have a legislative update on February 4th. We'll have a report on the AVID program on February 4th as well. and a report on the temporary alternative placement program. We also are going to schedule a work session for the 18th of February. That will be on the budget. The budget calendar has that date, the date for that work session as February 4th, but we can't do it that day. That's the day of the state or the county, and then we have a daytime meeting, so there was no way to squeeze that particular work session in. So we made the determination to go ahead and hold it on the 18th of February instead of the 4th.
Will I be correct in assuming it'll be immediately before the closed session?
Yes, it'll be right before the closed session. One o'clock. And actually, that will be the first meeting of the board in the new building. So that's all I have for agenda planning and future agenda items. If any members have requests for future agenda items, please don't hesitate to let me know. Board member comments, Mr. Grunendijk?
Nothing.
Mrs. Harshman?
Nothing.
Mrs. Williams?
I have nothing.
Mrs. Brightman?
I would just like to applaud the staff, the plumbers, the HVAC, the heating specialist, everyone who really jumped into the situation at Fountaindale and brought that to a good, hopefully a good conclusion. I think teachers were able to be in there. Part of the rooms were still open. My thoughts are, Dr. Wilcox, that there will be some classes there tomorrow.
That's great.
So this has been a tough winter so far, and we're just in sort of the beginning of it, or not even the middle yet. So thank you for staff and for everyone going above and beyond. Appreciate it.
Mrs. Fisher?
I'll just say ditto to that.
Mr. Bailey?
I would just like to thank my colleague, Mrs. Brightman, for the article that appeared in the local newspaper concerning the discipline issue that is being discussed at the state level. A number of my friends said that it helped them to understand some of the concerns that we as a board had, and help them to form an opinion as to the validity and value of that particular regulation. So thanks for the clarifying article.
Mr. Ridenour?
I apologize. When we had, Mrs. Brightman brought to my attention something I had forgotten with just a look. The Governor's Task Force on Arts Education in Maryland had a forum at Barbara Ingram on the 15th. Nice, little better turnout than I expected, a little less than I'd hoped. We have people from Frederick County, Garrett County, surprisingly, some from Washington County, teachers, parents, so on and so forth. The task force has sent out, or has online, a questionnaire that would be of great value to us as we continue on this in this task force. And if I could put this, and I've asked the support of my colleagues to have, if Richard wouldn't mind, to put this somewhere on our page and have a link to this particular address. The questionnaire is in there. I think we have maybe 500-600 people who have replied so far. Personally, I think 2,000 or 3,000 would be a heck of a lot better. Not only for information, but also to give it a little more punch when you present this to the governor, or the governor to the legislature, whatever the case might be. But the website, Richard, is www.aems-edu.org. And there's a Twitter also. It's at Arts Ed Task Force, and the questionnaire is there also. So if you get an opportunity, spend a couple of minutes to take a look at it and get an idea of what we're looking at and the type of information we're looking for, it would be greatly appreciated. And again, the more people that can take the time to do this, the better it helps the task force, as well as giving the governor a message of how we feel about arts education in Maryland. Thank you.
I was just going to say, I think Mr. Grunendijk might have access to some social media that would help some parents and others be connected to this. through the network at Barbara Ingram, perhaps.
Yeah, that would be.
I'm sure there's a lot of parents that would love to see that sort of thing.
And do you have 30 seconds on how the members of the council liked the Barbara Ingram School?
We took our leadership, the people who were there, I think there were 4 or 5 members, and we took them through, and they were very impressed and very, it was kind of funny because our student member knows when we arrived, there were students still there practicing in the hallways. It was pretty good. As a matter of fact, I enjoyed sitting there looking at them. I was getting ready to pull money out and throw it in the hat. But, yeah, they were very, very impressed with what we've been able to do.
Great. Great. I'll just add my thanks to Mrs. Brightman's comments as well. It's easy to take for granted when you get to school and the driveways are all plowed and the ice has been cleared from the sidewalks. And I know with all the weather we've had this year that the staff who takes care of that are overtaxed because they often have other things that they should be doing or would be doing if they weren't clearing snow. But it's just one reminder of just how many people it takes doing how many different jobs to get our schools open every day, to get our buses to the school safely, to get our children and our faculty into the building and out of the building where they're warm and in a place where that fosters learning. So thank you to everybody in the team who's helped us through all of the trying weather that we've had. Hopefully it will tail off soon, but I doubt it. There's no further business. I'll declare the meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone.